The courtroom filled quickly that morning, the kind of electric silence that arrives when a room knows it is about to witness something uncommon. People leaned forward in their seats as the bailiff called the case, Tara Collins versus Chase Langford. The Langford name carried weight in the city. It belonged to a family whose buildings rose above the skyline, whose logo appeared on plaques and cultural institutions, whose donations paid for programs and quiet influence. And so, when the heir to the family fortune walked into the room, the audience watched more than a defendant. They watched an image that had dominated civic life for years. Chase Langford was 28, tall, and immaculately groomed. He wore a dark navy suit and an understated tie, a diamond watch catching light as he adjusted his cufflinks. He moved with the confidence of a man raised in privilege and accustomed to having things yield to his will. When he took his seat at the defense table, his expression carried a faint smirk, an expression that spoke to a life in which consequences were usually negotiated away. Across the room sat Tara Collins, the plaintiff. She was in her early 40s, a small business owner who had opened a neighborhood cafe after years of saving and laboring to build something of her own. She wore a simple blouse and a look that combined fatigue and determination. Her hands were a little rough from work. Her eyes were focused and steady. She did not have influence or corporate lawyers. She had the truth and whatever courage it takes to bring it to public view. Judge Judith Marlowe presided. Known for her sharp clarity and measured temperament, she read the docket and then looked up. Tara Collins versus Chase Langford, the bailiff announced. The judge asked, as she always did, direct and efficient. Mr. Langford, you are charged with property damage and intimidation arising from an incident at Ms. Collins's business. How do you plead? Chase offered a dismissive smile and the word allegedly, as if that word could shrink a live person's harm into a rumor. Tara described the night in detail. She said it had been late, the cafe preparing to close, staff tidying chairs and counting out receipts. Chase had entered with companions, demanded service after hours, and when politely refused, had grown angry. He knocked over a chair, pushed a display, and left with a trailing threat. The next morning, glass lay shattered, and a costly display had been ruined. Even more troubling, the cafe's security footage had disappeared after an unannounced maintenance request authorized by the building's property management company. Chase's initial demeanor shifted as the judge walked through the timeline. He attempted to minimize, to laugh it off, to frame himself as the victim of overreaction. He leaned forward and, in a line that arrested the attention of everyone in the gallery, said, "Relax, Judge. I own half this city. Technically, I own you, too." The phrase hung in the air with the weight of a threat and the absurdity of a boast. Cameras, present to record public proceedings, captured the chill that swept the room. Judge Marlowe's response was not immediate anger, but a methodical gathering of facts. "This courtroom runs on something your money cannot buy," she said quietly. "It runs on truth and process." That single statement reframed the moment. What had momentarily become a spectacle of arrogance shifted into a legal inquiry about how influence interacts with accountability. The judge called for the exhibits. Clipped, grainy footage from the cafe's backup system played. The recording showed a late evening, tables stacked and staff in the act of closing. The door opened. Chase entered, clearly intoxicated, arguing with an employee. A shove, a crash, glass breaking, the display toppling. Chase's voice, captured faintly on the audio, was audible. "You'll regret this. My father owns this block." The image of entitlement became concrete. The footage did not lie. The court then examined the timeline of institutional responses. Tara had filed a police report the day after the incident. 2 days later, the case was marked closed for insufficient evidence. That closure was not unusual in isolation, but public records showed a donation to a municipal fund deposited by a Langford-affiliated entity 3 days after the investigation ended. The coincidence raised questions. It did not itself prove a quid pro quo, but it created a pattern that could not be ignored. Judge Marlowe's cross-referencing of records revealed additional context. 3 years earlier, an arrest for disorderly conduct by the same defendant had been dismissed after a donation to a community program. Another complaint in a different jurisdiction had been settled privately. This pattern suggested a mechanism by which consequences were often smoothed away. The bench offered no moralizing tirade. Instead, it asked pointed questions and requested documentation. It asked the institutions around the case to provide clarity where influence could obscure. Tara's lawyer walked the court through the implications of evidence removal. When surveillance systems are replaced hastily following an incident, the integrity of the chain of evidence is compromised. Insurance companies may still keep backups in remote servers. In this case, Tara's insurer had retained a copy, and that backup secured a crucial piece of documentary truth. The sequence of events at the cafe shown on camera matched her account. The video, the documents, and candid testimony created a credible narrative of wrongdoing and a plausible explanation for how evidence had been made unavailable. Judge Marlowe did something important. She named the harm not only in legal terms, but in social ones. She spoke about the ways small businesses compound risk as they operate on narrow margins. For Tara, the damage was not just a broken window. It was lost days of revenue, the cost of repair, and the risk of losing customer trust. The judge framed the ruling as a repair of harms done. Courts compensate for losses and, when necessary, impose punitive measures to deter behavior that uses status to intimidate and erase evidence. The defense countered with the predictable script of influence. Langford attorneys emphasized philanthropic contributions and community investments. They framed donations as evidence of civic engagement, not influence. They suggested the incident was a misunderstanding and asked that the court be cautious about drawing conclusions from circumstantial evidence. But the footage was decisive in the minds of many. The video's unembellished frame of action was persuasive. It captured what testimony could not distort, the sequence of events that led from an insult to an act of damage. The public record of donations and the timing of maintenance requests supplied context that made the defendant's claim of misunderstanding less plausible. The legal team attempted to introduce doubt, but the accumulation of documentary proof narrowed the space for plausible deniability. Judge Marlowe also considered the social symbolism at stake. She noted that when economic disparities create predictable patterns, it becomes necessary for institutions to apply public norms in ways that restore trust. The court's authority is not merely punitive, it is restorative. The judgment must correct a wrong for the plaintiff and signal the rule of law to the public. When Judge Marlowe delivered her verdict, the tone was deliberate. She found in favor of Tara Collins, awarding compensatory damages for the material loss and additional punitive damages to reflect the malicious intimidation and the interference with evidence. Furthermore, she ordered a referral to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential obstruction and improper influence connected to the maintenance request and the timing of donations. The referral did not assume criminality. It asked for independent review outside the civil context. Chase reacted with a mixture of indignation and panic. His lawyer announced an intent to appeal, a procedural right. The judge allowed that path, but reminded the courtroom that the public record would remain permanent. The ruling, she explained, would be searchable, archived, and available for future inquiries. Public record is enduring, and that permanence constrains future attempts to sanitize reputation through private channels. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was immediate. Media outlets replayed the footage and cited the judge's language. Social media amplified the most mimetic line, "I own half this city." But commentary also extended beyond sound bites into substantive conversation about the relationship between wealth and accountability. For many viewers, the spectacle was less important than the demonstrable functioning of institutions. There was relief in seeing evidence and process do what celebrity and influence could not. In the days that followed, the Langford family issued a carefully worded statement expressing regret for the incident while emphasizing cooperation with legal processes. The corporate message was polished and strategic, but it did not erase the record. The court's referral meant the possibility of an independent criminal review by prosecutors who could pursue potential obstruction or other offenses if the investigation warranted charges. Something else emerged from the coverage. A collection of other complaints and reports that, when assembled, produced a pattern. Not every allegation led to criminal charges or public hearings, but the visibility of the case encouraged others to report and to document grievances that previously had been handled quietly. Transparency, once activated, often produces a cascade of related disclosures. That cascade can restructure how institutions respond because once a narrative exists in the public record, Institutional actors feel pressure to test prior settlements and to re-examine patterns. Judge Marlowe's handling of the case became an instructive model for many viewers. She had not sought attention, she did not grandstand, she applied process, verified evidence, careful questioning, and a focus on repair and deterrence. That procedural steadiness is essential because institutions derive legitimacy from predictable, fair steps that do not depend on individual charisma. When a judge uses public mechanisms to test claims, the result is a durable reaffirmation that process can outrun power. For Tara, the relief was practical. The awarded damages would allow repair, replacement, and some mitigation of lost income. More than money, the judgment restored a measure of dignity. She had not been silenced. She had compelled public scrutiny and, through the court, received legal recognition of harm. That recognition mattered in ways that extended beyond her cafe. It signaled to neighbors and other small business owners that rights could be enforced when documentation and persistence met an impartial forum. For the public, the case became a touchstone in a wider debate. It was about money and influence, yes, but it was also about the capacity of public institutions to impose consequences when private privilege crosses legal lines. The spectacle of wealth confronting law had an effect beyond entertainment. It triggered civic conversation about municipal oversight, campaign finance, and the interactions between private donations and public decision-making. Some commentators noticed tangible consequences. Banks, insurers, and civic institutions began to review their relations and risk assessments more carefully. Boards and donors grew more attentive to reputational liabilities. The case did not upend an entire economic system, but it introduced a measurable cost to certain forms of behavior, and that shifting cost matter in reputation-driven sectors. The legal appeal would continue, as appeals often do, but appeals do not erase archives of court decisions. The public record would remain foundational. The morning in that small courtroom had entered civic memory because it documented how evidence and accountability functioned in practice. Judge Marlowe's closing remarks were a lesson in civic responsibility. She reminded the defendant that ownership carries obligation. To claim you own a city is to claim stewardship as much as title. Ownership without character corrodes institutions, she said, and the law's role is to ensure the social compact remains intact. Her words landed because they were tethered to evidence and to an enduring legal record. A few weeks later, Tara's Cafe reopened with fresh windows and repaired shelving. Customers returned, and the story of accountability circulated in the neighborhood like a slow kind of healing. Chase Langford retreated from the public glare and prepared his legal strategy. The Langford name retained capital, but the calculus about reputational risk had shifted. Beyond the immediate consequences for the parties involved, the case left a series of structural questions that civic actors could not ignore. Municipal leaders began to consider clearer rules governing relationships between major donors and local officials. Ethics boards debated more rigorous transparency requirements for gifts tied temporally to administrative outcomes. Legal scholars argued about whether civil remedies coupled with criminal referrals offered sufficient deterrence to repeated patterns of influence. Journalists pushed for better public data on maintenance contracts, building management practices, and the timing of large private contributions to public funds. Community groups pressed for investments in local dispute mechanisms so that small businesses would not have to carry the burden of evidence preservation alone. Insurance providers, realizing the magnitude of reputational risk, tightened policies about backup storage and access to third-party footage. Banks and corporate boards began to weigh the reputational downside of shielding insiders as part of a broader risk assessment. The case thus rippled outward in practical ways. It altered how institutions recorded transactions, how administrators flagged potential conflicts, and how citizens understood the tangible value of civic transparency. Chase's appeal would play out in slow motion through appellate filings and procedural wrangling. The legal outcome at higher levels remained uncertain, but the court's record, video, public filings, and the referral remained permanent. That permanence is crucial in democratic life because it preserves a public archive that others can consult and act upon. In many respects, the trial's deeper impact was not the money awarded, but the activation of a public ledger that constrained the easy smoothing of consequences with private checks. This was not a sweeping revolution. It was a measured assertion that the mechanisms of justice still have purchase. For citizens who had felt powerless in the face of influence, the case offered an example of process that vindicates rights when exercised persistently. It also reminded the powerful that power does not grant immunity from consequence. Institutions, when functioning, provide a forum where the vulnerable can seek redress. The morning in that small courtroom delivered a practical reassurance. Dignity can be defended with documents and testimony, and public records can outlast private influence. The victory belonged not to spectacle, but to procedure, and that is perhaps a more hopeful measure of what justice can do.
But inside that courtroom, money didn't win, truth did. Tara Collins was a small cafe owner who spent years building her business through hard work and sacrifice. On the other side stood Chase Langford, the wealthy heir to a powerful family who believed influence could erase consequences. Everything changed when the cafe's security footage was shown in court. The video revealed the damage, the intimidation, and the arrogance that followed. Judge Judith Marlowe responded with a message that stunned the room. This courtroom runs on something your money cannot buy. The judge ruled in Tara's favor, awarding compensatory and punitive damages, while also referring the case for further investigation into possible obstruction and abuse of influence. This wasn't just a case about a broken cafe window. It became a story about accountability, justice, and the power of evidence. In the end, the victory didn't belong to wealth or status. It belonged to truth, process, and the rule of law. Do you think powerful people should always be held accountable like this?